To ride aboard a fast-moving train carrying a traveling circus is to know what fantasy is like. The fascination of the railroad, combined with the allure of the circus, creates a movable spectacle on rails.
There is a magical connection between the circus and the railroad. Trains infer travel from afar, things coming from out of your own little universe to come and visit you, to come and see you. And the circus is one of those things that also brought things from afar. People and extraordinary talents from distant countries and foreign cultures. And when you blend the two together, you get this kind of a magical mix of this magic city that's going to appear for one day only. And it's arriving by train, and it leaves by train.
Those who have made the journey know that a circus train is far different from anything else coming down the tracks.
We're not your business as usual train departing the yard. We're the circus train. We've got animals, we've got people, we've got equipment, and the railroads look upon that as something that they really have to treat specially. They have to possibly call extra crews for us, extra personnel to handle this train. So the railroads don't treat us like a regular train. They treat us like the special train that we are.
In their heyday, a circus train could conjure up images of a nomadic life few would know.
The people really looked at us with great admiration, and I think a lot of them thought, God, I'd love to get on that train and go off with them, run away with the circus.
Though the idea of moving a circus by rail seems reasonable today, it was a risky venture when first attempted during the 1800s. Circuses originated in England and were brought to the United States at the turn of the 19th century. Crowds were thrilled by trick horseback riding, acrobatics, and the antics of clowns. Early circuses were held in wooden amphitheaters, allowing performers to stay in one city for several weeks at a time. But in 1825, everything changed. Circus owners wanted to reach a wider audience and began holding performances in portable tents. That meant a circus could hold a performance, take down its tents, and move on to the next town. In order to haul their canvas, poles, and other necessary equipment, circuses began to move by wagons. The life of the traveling circus had begun. Great for the audience, but not for the employees.
It was all drawn by horses. It all moved over a road which varied in condition from fairly good to awful quagmires, where movement was almost impossible. And the speed of movement could only be that a horse could travel, a walking horse, and that was like 5 miles per hour.
These shows that traveled over the country were derogatorily referred to as mud shows because oftentimes that's what they encountered, seas of mud as they traveled from one site to another. As one would watch these groups of wagons and animals and people across the countryside, it almost gave the feeling of watching a train with all the elements connected together, one following another, trying to find out which is the best way to the next city.
At the same time these fledgling circuses were seeking out new audiences, early railroads were beginning to expand. By the 1850s, railroads had stretched west to the Mississippi River. The ability to travel great distances by rail caught the attention of circus owners. Train travel was faster than forcing a circus crew to slug it out on muddy roads. But early train cars were not built to carry an entire circus. This meant that if a circus decided to travel by train, something had to go.
In the 1850s and 1860s, when circuses used railroads on a limited basis, oftentimes they found out that the only way they could do it was to eliminate their menagerie, their sideshow, and the daily street parade, things that people had become accustomed to seeing as part of their circus experience. Because of these reduced elements, other showmen would refer to these railroad transported shows in a derogatory fashion as railroad shows, because it suggested that they weren't a complete circus.
However, there was good reason to transport a circus by rail. When moved by train, performers and animals not only arrived at their destination faster, but well rested from a relaxing overnight trip. In 1856, the Spaulding and Rogers Circus was the first to have train cars especially built for their needs. Gilbert Spaulding had his cars designed to travel on both rails and roads. The circus traveled by train as far as the rails would allow. Then the show continued its journey moving overland. But because the rail cars frequently bogged down in mud, Spaulding was forced to give up his experiment and return to traditional wagon travel. While circus owners searched for a solution, a momentous meeting of rails forever changed the face of the nation. On May 10, 1869, crews working on the first transcontinental railroad joined tracks at Promontory, Utah. The link made it possible to travel by train from coast to coast.
Shortly after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, Wisconsin circus man Dan Costello put his circus on a train and took it all the way to the West Coast. It really is an example of how pioneering circus men were in their marketing and business efforts. Here we have the railroad just barely completed, and already a showman is on the tracks, taking his show to places where one had never gone before. It gives you some idea of the entrepreneurial spirit of these early showmen.
But even with travel possible to the Pacific Ocean, Costello's circus continued to face the same barriers that had plagued circuses traveling by train. Little did he know that he and an ambitious entrepreneur named P.T. Barnum were about to embark on a venture that would revolutionize the industry. Within a few years, the greatest show on earth would become a major road show, traveling to cities everywhere by train. By 1869, when the Dan Costello Circus made its successful train trip to the West Coast, there was agreement among many circus owners. Wherever the railroads were going, circuses were going with them. But operating costs remained high, and the inconsistency of rail service was still a major obstacle.
One has to bear in mind that in the middle of the 19th century, the railroads did not reach everywhere in America. Not only that, but there were a multitude of different gauges throughout the various areas of the country. That meant that if you had your own string of railroad cars, you could not readily travel necessarily from one railroad to another. Even within the same community, it might be served by several railroads, but they might not connect with one another.
By the early 1870s, American railroads gradually began to standardize. The circus was ready to take advantage of this development. After his momentous tour to California, Dan Costello embarked on a new venture. He teamed up with a man named William Cameron Coop to create a new circus. Coop had worked as a laborer and manager in circuses for more than 20 years. Together, they decided that in order to succeed, they needed to attach a famous name to their circus, one guaranteed to garner attention. They approached perhaps the most famous showman of their time, an aging ringleader named P.T. Barnum.
Barnum was one of the most extraordinary people that this nation has ever known. He gets, I think, a bit of a bad rap from all of this talk about he was a humbug and a sucker's born every minute. I guess if Barnum were alive in the 1950s and 60s, he would probably have been the man who promoted Elvis Presley and the Beatles.
In the 1840s, Barnum broke into show business through lectures and demonstrations he held on freakish oddities at the American Museum in New York City. For 25 cents, Barnum provided the curious with glimpses of bearded ladies, sword swallowers, and giants. In 1842, Barnum discovered a 5-year-old midget named Charles Stratton. He changed the boy's name to General Tom Thumb and took him on tour. Tom's impersonations of famous people such as Napoleon made him a major star, and P.T. Barnum a wealthy man. By the time Costello and Coop approached Barnum with their idea for a circus, Barnum was 60 years old. He had won and lost several fortunes and was quietly living in semi-retirement. But always a shrewd investor, Barnum knew the idea for a traveling circus was a good one. Together, the three men invested $100,000, and the wagons of Barnum's Traveling World's Fair went on the road. The profits during the circus's first year were impressive. It brought in a sum equaling approximately $6 million in today's money. Despite their success, Costello, Coop, and Barnum were frustrated by the slow pace of moving overland. Their circus was often forced to perform in small towns where meager audiences reduced their profits. In 1872, they made a crucial decision that would forever change how a circus did business. Their circus would move exclusively by railroad.
When Barnum, Coop, and Costello put together that very first circus train in 1872, they really set the stage for the railroad circus of the next 80 years.
The train was nearly 70 cars long. Every aspect of it was geared to making circus travel easier. Horses were transported in stock cars that featured padding, feeding troughs, and individual stalls. Cars that carried elephants were fitted with smaller windows because the animals were more susceptible to the cold. Passenger cars purchased from railroad companies were converted into sleeping cars for the employees. Workers were crammed into bunks stacked 3 high on each side of the aisle, but few complained. It was a huge improvement over getting no sleep at all while traveling by wagon. The circus also bought extra-long flat cars that were rigged to haul wagons. The wagons were loaded with baggage or were decorated for circus parades. Though the circus had P.T. Barnum's name, it was W.C. Coop who developed the revolutionary loading and unloading logistics that made the circus train operation work. To eliminate confusion among the crew, Coop assigned each laborer a specific task, a first for the circus. Coop had the hand brake wheels removed from the tops of the flat cars. This allowed crews and wagons to move along the cars unobstructed. Finally, he reorganized how wagons were loaded and unloaded. Prior to 1872, wagons were manhandled on and off the flat cars from the side. Coop revolutionized the industry by placing connecting plates between each flat car.
W.C. Coop in 1872 was the innovator of the modern circus train regarding loading the wagons onto the flat cars. He had the foresight to envision loading these flat cars from one end and crossing the wagons from one flat car to the other using crossover plates. And that innovation was brand new in its time, and it's still the way we load the circus train today.
Now, Barnum's Traveling World's Fair was capable of moving 100 miles or more in a night. The efforts of Coop, Barnum, and Costello not only revolutionized the way railroad shows traveled, but they brought about a radical shift in how the public perceived the circus.
The term railroad circus had been used in a derogatory fashion because it meant a reduced size and scope circus, a circus without a sideshow, a menagerie, or a daily street parade. But this 1872 Barnum show caused a change in the meaning of the term railroad circus. It meant that you were going to have a full day's experience, from being able to watch the show arrive and unload to being inside the big top when they put on the show. It meant that this was the grandest form, the ultimate flowering of the circus in America.
Newspaper reviews of the new Barnum Railroad Circus were unanimous.
They have shown us how big a thing a traveling exhibition may be, and also how harmonious it may work. It will be a long time before the people will have much faith in or desire to see a small show. Reporter from the St. Louis Republican, 1872.
The heyday of the Railroad Tent Show had begun. By 1885, there were 14 complete railroad circuses. In 1900, as many as 20. By 1910, 30 big train shows entertained millions across the country. One of the shows that rose to prominence during this period was owned by 5 brothers from Wisconsin. The Ringling Brothers began their careers singing and playing musical instruments. They launched their first circus on May 19, 1884, when the Yankee Robinson Ringling Brothers Grand Double Shows gave its premiere performance. The circus traveled as an overland wagon show until 1890.
The growth of the Ringling Circus was really phenomenal. They went on the rails in 1890. In 5 years, they doubled the size of their train from 18 to 38 cars, as I recall. In the next 5 years, it went up by another 50%. During the next 10 years, up another 50%.
In 1903, the 3 largest circuses were the Ringling Brothers' World's Greatest Shows, the Barnum and Bailey Greatest Show on Earth, and the Adam Forepaugh Sells Brothers Show. But the Ringlings did not stop growing. In 1905, they gained half interest in the Adam Forepaugh Sells Brothers Show. 3 years later, they bought Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth. By 1908, they owned the 3 largest circuses in the world. After the season of 1918, the Ringling and Barnum circuses were combined. The unified show traveled on 100 railroad cars, each 60 feet long. The train was so large it had to travel in 4 sections. Together, they measured over 6,000 feet in length, the largest train that had ever been assembled. The crowds turned out and the money flowed. The circus was big business. But big business required aggressive marketing to ensure success. Promotion on a grand scale was the answer. Circus ad men cut their swath across the American landscape, riding the rails. The dual jobs of getting the message out and bringing the public in would depend upon the train. From 1870 through the early 1900s, the Big Top Railroad Circus took center stage as the nation's most anticipated entertainment event. As the ability to transport larger shows became possible, circuses had become cash-generating machines for their owners. Profits were often reinvested. This ignited competition to see who could exhibit the most lavish parades, spectacles, and acts. Circuses became huge, extravagant events. Bigger investments meant bigger risks. Circus owners began demanding more out of their trains. Circus cars were built longer to carry more people, animals, and equipment. With so much money invested in a circus train, every avenue of generating revenue had to be mined. Circus advertising began to emphasize the train to promote the circus.
It was not uncommon for circuses to advertise the fact, and proudly so, that they were a railroad circus. It meant that they were a huge aggregation with great amounts of capital invested in their railroad trains, in their parade wagons, their tents, their equipment. It was a fact that they trumpeted in the loudest possible terms on their posters, on billboards, in their handbills, in their couriers, by every means possible to educate the public that this was a fantastically huge outfit that was going to be coming into town by railroad.
Circus advance men were sent to towns to promote upcoming shows. They rode regularly scheduled passenger trains in cars called advertising cars. A big circus might have 3 or 4 advertising cars. One would arrive in a town 3 weeks before a circus, another 2 weeks in advance, a third would show up a few days before the show. Outside, the cars were rolling advertisements. Circus names and colorful murals were emblazoned on the sides. Inside, advertising cars were rolling weapons of the ad wars. They were loaded with stacks of posters and press releases. A boiler was kept hot to cook the paste used to plaster posters all over town. Wedged in between everything else were bunks for the crew. An advance team would paste as many as 6,000 sheets of paper in and around a community that the circus planned to visit. Local businesses and farmers were given complimentary tickets in exchange for permission to turn their buildings into billboards. Situations would turn ugly when an advance team from one circus would cross paths with a team from a competitor.
This resulted sometimes in one show's advance crew tearing down the paper from another show or plastering their own paper on top of another show's paper. To combat these ventures, they would often name their crews the brigade or the opposition crew. And these were men that were specially set about to handle the other competing shows' advance crews. And it wasn't uncommon that they might come to fisticuffs or things of that nature. And indeed, the names that were applied to them more or less defined a warlike operation.
A good advance team could work an entire town into a frenzy. By the time a circus train arrived, crowds would line the tracks, children would skip school, and businesses would close for the day.
Now to remember, that time, there was an oppressive tedium to life. We believed in God. We worked as hard as we could. The next day, the people had to do the same thing over and over again. And the circus brought something exotic. What a welcome relief from all of that sameness that went on.
But even the work of a crack advance crew couldn't overcome the miles that separated people who lived in the country from the towns where the circuses performed. W.C. Coop, the operations manager of the P.T. Barnum Circus, came up with a solution. If the circus couldn't come to the people, then a train would bring the people to the circus. Coop convinced the railroads to schedule extra trains to travel to cities hosting the circus on performance days. The railroads obliged by offering discount fares aboard excursion trains for the people who lived up to 70 miles away from where the circus was playing. The idea was an instant hit. During one season, more than 400,000 people came to the Barnum and Bailey shows on excursion trains.
The zenith of circus train operations in the United States probably took place around 1910 and 11, when there were some 30 different circuses operating in the United States by rail.
With so much income being generated by circus trains, everyone wanted in on the act. But running an 80-car train was expensive. In an effort to capitalize on the popularity of the shows, smaller circuses began traveling the rails, usually in 2 cars. 2-car shows rolled through smaller towns in rural America. They performed in the mountains of Tennessee and Virginia. They traveled along the coal roads of Kentucky and West Virginia, through the Dakotas and sparsely settled areas of the Southwest and Canada. One car was home to management and the performers. The second car held everything else. They were miniature productions, in a business that placed a great value on size.
They were really the antithesis of the big flat car operations in the sense that everything was compactly put together, kind of in a disorganized but closely packed way inside the baggage car, but yet they could still get the show up and down each and every day.
Inventory for a typical two-car show included a lion, 16 goats, a camel, 3 draft horses, a bear, an elephant, 15 ponies, and canvas for 3 tents, one for the performances, one for a sideshow, and one in which performers could change. Loading and unloading a two-car show was different from the big leagues. Everything was unloaded at a train station by hand, placed on wagons, and wheeled to the show site. Two-car shows were not private trains like larger circuses. The cars were attached to a regularly scheduled passenger train. To make moving their shows on rails affordable, owners of two-car shows devised ingenious ways to manipulate railroad rules to their benefit. For example, if one group of people purchased 25 first-class tickets on a train, a baggage car could be pulled by the train for free. Owners often bought tickets to get the free car. The only problem was, two-car circuses often employed as many as 70 people. When conductors came to collect the tickets, laborers hid among the animals and equipment to avoid paying their fare. Another way two-car shows turned a profit was by using the ads of another circus as their own. The name of the old circus would be changed and the new name put on. In some cases, it was easier just to change the name of the touring circus to one that was already on the poster. Brothers J. Augustus and Elmer Jones were the kings of the two-car shows. For more than 30 years, they put on shows across the country, many at the same time. At various stages, they were known as the Cole and Rogers shows or the Buffalo Ranch Wild West. But doing business on the cheap often caught up to them. One time they used ads from another circus that bragged about having 11 elephants. It was a difficult moment when the brothers rolled into town and the crowd discovered not one elephant in the show.
In some cases, shows tolerated grift, the shortchanging of people visiting the show, the presence of pickpockets, gamblers, or things of that nature. In order to avoid the heat from one season to another, they'd change the name of the circus. Other times, it was just a poor quality show. And in order to dupe the same people a second year in a row, they might have changed the title of the show.
Whether large or small, circus trains had taken the nation by storm. Their arrival in any town marked a time of celebration and entertainment. But within a few decades, the circus would be ripped from the rails. A volatile stock market and labor turmoil would put the nation's beloved circus trains on a track to oblivion. Well into the 20th century, the combination of circus and train remained unchallenged as America's premier entertainment. As train circuses barnstormed across the country, other showmen noticed their successful use of the railroads. Suddenly, all kinds of shows wanted to travel by rail. One of the amusements which capitalized on the convenience of rail travel was the whale show. The carcass of a whale was preserved in formaldehyde and moved in a custom-built car.
It's very difficult to transport a beast as large as a whale around the countryside. One way this was overcome was to have special length railroad cars constructed that could contain the carcass of an entire dead whale. These would be transported to a suitable site. Sometimes special railroad track would be laid right into the center of a downtown community. At that location, the car would then be opened up, special scaffolding and access platforms installed, and huge banners talking about the tremendous whale that was to be seen therein erected on the outside of the enclosure. And then it was time to open for business.
The Uncle Tom's Cabin show was another form of entertainment that saw the benefit of trains.
These are shows that staged various versions of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel and oftentimes would travel by 2 or 3 railroad cars. Some of them carried parade wagons. Some of them had special railroad cars built just to suit their own specific purposes. But they were a very popular form of show, and there were literally dozens of these Uncle Tom's Cabin shows that went around the country during the late 19th and early 20th century.
The production that most closely paralleled a circus was the Wild West Show. These exhibitions dated back to 1883, when a former Indian scout named Buffalo Bill Cody created his first show.
Wild West shows operated almost like a circus. They had the same type of railroad car-based advertising campaigns. Their trains were almost the same as circus trains. They had stock cars for animals, flat cars for their wagons, passenger cars for their people. They moved about the country on a daily basis.
The major difference between the circus and the Wild West Show was in the performance. Whereas the circus combined acrobatic and aerial acts with special music composed for the show, the Wild West Show was largely a recreation of events from Western American history. Regardless of the type of exhibition, for show people who called the train their home, living conditions on board changed little over time.
When we were with Ringling Brothers Circus in my day, if we look back on it in retrospect to where I'm living today in a home with air conditioning and hot water and cold water and everything else, it was a little primitive, but we didn't know the difference. That's the way it was.
On trains owned by the big circuses, how well a person lived was determined by the social order of the show. The more important a person was, the better they had it. And none were more important than the circus owners. They traveled in the comfort of their own private cars, complete with a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and dining room. With rare exceptions, upper-level managers and premier performers were given special compartments, though not as plush as the owners. An exception may have been made for Lillian Lietzel, the queen of the aerialists for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus during the 1920s. She may have had her own private car. But crew members had to tolerate quite different conditions.
If you were a working man or a concession man, they slept 2 together in a berth 3 high. The lower down the echelon you went, then you would be 2 in a berth 3 high. As you went up a little bit, then you probably had 1 in a berth 3 high.
Female cast members didn't fare much better. They also shared sleeper cars with little privacy and no storage.
We had a girls' car, which all the girls stayed in one car. And at the beginning of the season, you were assigned your particular berth. And if you'd been with the circus several years, you got the honor of having the bottom bunks. But if you didn't, you had to climb up to the top one. So I was fortunate that I had a lower bunk all the time.
But it was sort of an unwritten rule when you got up to your berth at night. You tried not to step in the face of the person sleeping below you, which could easily be done.
After every performance, the circus cast and crew would head back to the train. Once loaded, it would chug out of town for an overnight run. But travel by train was not easy. Circuses did much of their performing during the summers. The heat inside the cars would often become unbearable.
In fact, the performers would go out and sleep on the side of the tracks at night on the grass. It was so hot. And the darn train would pull off and leave them. They'd have to get a bus in pajamas and everything else to get to the next town.
The center of social life on circus trains was the diner, which the travelers affectionately referred to as the pie car.
You've got to remember this pie car was open to all performers and all working men and all peoples. Now these men, these elephant men, had maybe loaded the elephants. The horse people had loaded the horses, so when they came in at night, they didn't have a chance to shower before they get in there. But after a while, you kind of got used to that, and you could turn to somebody next to you who was maybe very, very rich and say, "Hi, how are you tonight?" But that was all part of it. That was part of being the circus and accepting what you were. That was part of the joy. And the food was quite good in there, really very, very good.
One of the favorite pastimes of people traveling with the circus was to watch the world go by. During the hot summer, they often sat on the flat cars or on top of the stock cars to enjoy the view. Sometimes they even slept there. Every morning they'd wake up in a new town. Every evening they'd see thousands of new faces. Life on the train became the only life they knew.
It was our home. It was all we had. It meant a great deal to us, and we got the same emotional feeling walking into the train at night, even though I had an upper berth that was very small, as, "Hey, gosh, I'm home. Isn't this great?"
Life on the circus train was not without danger. Train wrecks occurred frequently throughout the history of the railroads. Circus trains were not immune. The worst circus train wreck in American history happened on June 22, 1918. The train carrying the Hagen-Beck-Wallace Circus experienced mechanical problems and came to a halt on the tracks. Suddenly, an empty troop train slammed into it from the rear. As many as 85 people were killed. 175 more were injured. Amazingly, after the accident, the Hagen-Beck-Wallace Circus missed only 2 engagements before performing again, a testament to the old saying, "The show must go on." As the 20th century progressed, amusement parks, vaudeville, and movies began to draw the public's attention away from the big top, eroding a once loyal audience base. The Depression of the 1930s also had a negative effect on the train circus. People couldn't afford to attend the shows. Finally, during the Second World War, skyrocketing labor and freight costs put more and more circuses on the brink of bankruptcy. At the turn of the century, there were more than 30 large circus trains traveling the country. By the mid-1950s, only 2 remained. With the country relying less and less on railroads for transportation, it seemed the magical era of the circus train was quickly approaching the end of the line. On July 16, 1956, the tents of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus were erected for the last time. The show, held in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was seen by 10,000 people. When it was over, the band played Auld Lang Syne. The era of the circus train had ended. Economic pressures had become too great. The operation of a train-based circus could not work in the modern age.
The demise of the railroad tent circus was greeted almost like the death of a friend by many people in the circus community. It was a form and a tradition that had existed for over 80 years. People who had literally looked upon the circus as their entire life wondered, was life going to go on? Would the show go on?
The Ringling Brothers Circus packed up its train and made a somber 3-day journey back to its home in Sarasota, Florida.
That trip from Pittsburgh to Sarasota was indeed like a funeral trip. It was extremely sad. People didn't know what their futures were going to be. And I don't think they thought that this thing would ever go out again as it was. And of course it never did go out as a tent show again.
Later that year, the Clyde Beatty Circus, the only circus still traveling by rail, also gave up its train. Ironically, circus transportation had come full circle. They now moved about the country by bus, truck, and car over land, just as circuses had done nearly a century before.
In some ways, traveling with a motorized show replicated the same feelings that had existed with the Overland show. Now you again were back to loading and unloading the show and driving the trucks overland between your various engagements. So it meant reduced sleeping hours and more physical labor on the part of the participants within the motorized truck show.
But there were advantages to traveling by truck and trailer. By the late 1950s, the nation's interstate highway system was in place. It was possible to reach more arenas and stadiums than ever before. But that benefit did not make up for the problems circuses encountered traveling by road. The Ringling Brothers discovered that highway travel was more costly than expected. Breakdowns, traffic jams, and bad weather played havoc on show schedules. In 1959, Ringling Brothers management decided they'd had enough of trucks and traffic. Starting in 1960, the circus would once again travel by train. It still needed stock cars, baggage cars, and a pie car, but the new train had a modern look. Steam engines were replaced by diesels, and what was once wood and iron became shiny aluminum. The train was affordable because it consisted of fewer cars than in the past. Since the circus was performing in arenas, it no longer had to transport the equipment and labor force needed to erect a huge tent city. Over the years, the new arena-style circus grew, and the train operation expanded with it. The modern Ringling train was so successful that in 1969, a second train was added to the Ringling's operations. The two trains continue to keep the circus train tradition alive to this day.
Life on the circus train really is magical for a few reasons. Number one is the community that you're living in. You're living with people from all over the world, with all different talents and skills, meeting fascinating people. And the proximity of living on the train creates a special bonding with that as well.
When I first joined the show, I was on a communal car with 16 girls, and you really have to go with the flow. But living in close quarters on the train is kind of like dorm life. There's always somebody up, somebody awake, or somebody around. So in that fact, there's always company. It's not like you're really ever alone.
When people see the circus train, it's always a positive reaction, whether we're riding along the rails parallel to a highway and cars are keeping up with us to look at the train and look at the people on the train, or if we're in an urban area and we're going across a road crossing where normally people would honk for a train and become irritated with us. They oftentimes turn off their engines and watch the train go by, and they're always waving. It's a special train that when you see it, you really know it's a circus train.
But for fans who wish to experience the circus trains of a bygone era, the past has not been forgotten. Once a year, the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, runs a vintage turn-of-the-century circus train. Pulled by a classic steam locomotive, the train carries the museum's collection of historic circus wagons through the countryside to Milwaukee. When the train arrives, the wagons are unloaded using the same procedures employed by crews nearly a century ago. The wagons then become part of a grand procession through the streets of the city. Thousands of delighted spectators turn out, hoping to catch a glimpse of Circus's past. It's an event that few can resist. If he were here, P.T. Barnum would be proud.